This podcast is a production of Queens Public Television in New York City. Visit us on the web at qptv.org.
Hey, I'm Mark Bacino, and this is Queens Creative. Welcome to another installment of the Queens Creative Podcast, coming to you from Queens Public Television in New York City. Big thanks to everyone out there listening for joining us. On today's pod, I welcome the fabulous country singer-songwriter, radio DJ, and Jackson Heights, Queens resident, Laura Cantrell. A favorite of famed British DJ John Peel and music legend Elvis Costello, the Nashville-born Ms. Cantrell has 5 album releases to her credit as an artist and has showcased her talents as a guest on such iconic programs as a Prairie Home Companion and the Grand Ole Opry. And if that wasn't enough for you, in addition to her work as an artist, Laura is also an acclaimed DJ, creator of the long-running radio Thrift Shop on local New York area radio, and more recently, host of the programs Dark Horse Radio and States of Country on satellite and streaming radio, respectively. Listen in on this episode as Laura and I discuss Laura's Nashville beginnings, her music, her love of radio, what it was like to sing with Elvis Costello, and much more. Then, after our talk, be sure and stick around as Laura treats us to a special live performance from our home here in New York City. All right, let's get to it and jump into my fun conversation with the great Miss Laura Cantrell. So hey, Laura, welcome to Queens Creative. Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Mark, thanks for having me.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you. So I just wanted to dive right in and talk about a bunch of stuff with you. But for starters, I wanted to discuss your backstory. You're a longtime New Yorker, currently living in Queens, but you're originally from Nashville. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Tennessee?
Sure. I did grow up in Nashville, which is, people I think are more familiar with the city of Nashville than they used to be. When I would say I was from Nashville, it always kind of conjures up some country music associations for people who maybe know music. In the last few years, there's been a TV show about Nashville, and, country music is even more kind of mainstream pop than it used to be. So I feel like people have more of an idea. It's more of a tourist destination now. I noticed when I have a finance job, and I have for many years. It's kind of my rent-paying job, and there's a group of women in our sales department who were planning a bachelorette getaway to Nashville, and that's when I knew that it was taking on a different, sort of awareness people were having of it outside of the city than it used to be. But growing up there it was very cool. It was much like growing up in any sort of small or mid-sized city. I went to Catholic school. My parents were in the legal profession. My dad was a judge, and my mom was a lawyer and a judge. And so, I kind of grew up around the courthouse and their doings when I was a little kid. But both of them really loved music, and they're actually 10 years apart in age. My dad's 10 years older than my mom. So his musical taste was very old-fashioned, even for someone of his generation. He's 86 now. But he loved like music of the 20s and 30s and old hit parade and very early Grand Ole Opry and bluegrass and stuff like that. My mom was a more typical, child of the 60s who came of age in the 60s. So she loved Joan Baez and folk era stuff and a lot of rock and roll of, the late 60s, early 70s. So
it's a good mix.
It was a good mix in the house. And there were some, points and artists that they both shared that they appreciated. They both loved Johnny Cash, and my dad, for whatever reason, likes Pete Seeger. And so, that was something my mom also could relate to.
Yeah, they could connect on those, on that level. Yeah.
Stuff. So cool. Yeah, it was, and they also love show tunes and shows. And, so we had a lot of different musical stuff going on in my house from a young age. And that was just particular to my family, but I'm very grateful because that's where the roots of my own music interest, I think, really begin.
Right, right. Yeah, I see. And you're a survivor of Catholic school like myself. That's that's cool.
Yes.
I caught that. Yeah, and actually you lead right into my next question, really, which was, obviously Nashville is a huge music town, but it's you sort of semi-answered it, being that your folks were interested in different types of music. But I was curious to ask how you got your music bug, meaning, how did you start to get the interest in terms of playing and singing and that kind of thing?
Well, I actually I took piano lessons, and I was kind of, I don't know, 7 or 8 years of piano. I wasn't super. I always loved it, but I wasn't. I actually switched teachers when I was just going into high school, and my new teacher was more serious and kind of pushing theory and. Or not that I had learned theory, but they were pushing what you could do with it. So teaching improvisation and it was right at the moment when I was starting to have a more social life of my own and stuff. And that's what I've always regretted, not hanging in there, because with that level of music education, I kind of stopped. Because I realized later when I was in college and I was starting to play guitar, and that some of that music, more technical background would have been useful, because I had more serious, I wanted to be good at an instrument and to be able to walk into a room of musicians and be able to play with them. And so It took me, I had to kind of coach myself and do some, extra woodshedding to get to where I could play comfortably with a band and not just be the girl singer, but actually, hang out and play in a band. And that's, I've started doing that when I was in college. I always was interested in music. Unfortunately, my school system, they didn't actually have a lot of music. Ironically, for Nashville, it wasn't a big part of our music, our education. So, there weren't opportunities to be in a, ensemble or something. I did sing in the choir at church and that kind of stuff. But
cool.
So it wasn't really till I got to New York and I realized that I was kind of I'd already somewhat hung around with music loving kids, and I had worked at the Country Music Hall of Fame as a tour guide. So I had some background knowledge about the history of country music, which coming to New York to go to school, I often just played that. That was my party trick when you're just getting to know people. I was the Southern girl who worked at the Country Music Hall of Fame and could tell them all about, Dolly Parton or Kitty Wells or whatever.
Right.
But coming to Columbia, I realized, and I was very lucky to fall in with the kids at the campus radio station, because there were some really serious music loving and sort of people who were going to, whether they worked professionally in music or not, were going to always be serious music fans. It was to a different level of seriousness. And I realized I kind of fell into that camp, and I gravitated towards people who had that, kind of serious appreciation. And those were probably the first people that I played music with.
Really?
Were kids from the campus radio station. I had a couple little side bands, just really for fun. But then I would always be the most, kind of the person in whatever informal group was the most excited to maybe try to get a real gig or to get, or to play shows. It wasn't, so I realized I was a little bit more, I enjoyed all those aspects of it and was more ambitious to actually turn it into something that I could do more, I wasn't even thinking about professionally, but I was thinking about it being good at it and being serious about it.
Now, you weren't playing it, so you weren't playing in a high school garage band or anything like that. You never did. That's interesting.
I did hang around. I had a couple of friends who had bands, but because my instrument and had been piano, I didn't really know how to be a keyboard player or and I couldn't play guitar, so I had to kind of figure that out when I got to college. And
I see. I see.
So yeah.
Wow, that's it. And I share with you the regret of not finishing studying music proper. I mean, I've been making music for years, like you, and making records and stuff, and just I wish I would have stuck it out in terms of the theory side of things. I just totally abandoned that and never went further with it. But you do what you can.
Right. Well, and also you have a whole lifetime to work on this stuff. So, I realized like, wow, it's a bummer I bailed on, improvisation in high school, because that probably that to me was the first thing that didn't totally come naturally, as just in terms of what I'd already done on piano. So I was a little intimidated by it, and I just backed away from it. And I realized later, like, well, you don't ever get better by backing away.
Right.
So you have to kind of go back and
lean into it. Yeah.
Address it and work your way through it. So,
wow.
It's interesting because now my daughter is 14 and she's a freshman at LaGuardia and she plays cello. And so watching her as a cello student, really continue to be, there have been many points where I thought like I probably would have quit at that point. But she's continued to
sticking with
grow and stick with it. It's been really great.
Yeah, it's funny how kids do that. Like my son is also majoring in music in high school, and he's a drummer. And so he's doing all this technical stuff with, reading and paradiddles, and he's learning to read. And I'm like, well, it's great that you're doing that. It's like, just stick with it. Don't, I could see that point where he wanted to throw in the towel. Right. And then it was like he kind of pushed his way through it, and now he's actually into it, so it's an interesting thing. Now, you'd mentioned college, and that was what I wanted to ask you about that, because I was curious about that. So sort of jumping forward, you come to New York City to attend Columbia University, and from what I read, it really seems like, and from what you're saying, you really kind of hit the ground running. Artistically speaking, like you're DJing on the college radio station, you're singing in an indie rock band, like with Mac McGowan of Superchunk, right. And it really sounds like you're having a lot of fun. It sounds like it's a creative time for you. So what was that like, coming to New York from Nashville? What was that experience like for you? I know you touched on it, but maybe you could explain a little more about it.
Well, it was pretty interesting. I think I had a very common experience where, when I was leaving this sort of Southern culture, coming to New York, and I hadn't really thought a lot in high school about, I'd read, some Southern authors, and I knew I liked country music, but I hadn't thought about it in a different way where, with the remove of not being inside of it anymore, you get a perspective on, what is that about country music that I really like? What is it that makes me want to continue to sort of study it, be studious about it. And so fortunately, I just was lucky. Columbia was a great environment. It didn't matter, what you were studying. There were just a lot of creative people there, obviously a lot of very bright people. So it was a really vibrant environment. And there was, because we weren't, I think it's a little different than like NYU kids are down in the midst of downtown. So they'd all get to go out in the city. But in Columbia, you're sort of up in a little bubble of...
You're ensconced up there.
Up there at the Upper West Side. And, it takes a few years to orient yourself to where what else is in New York City. So I think, there was this kind of like sort of just communing with the other students and having our own little scene, of just what, listening to records in dorm rooms and the radio station and hanging out late, and, you're sort of reading for whatever your courses are and listening to music. And, it just was a great time to kind of immerse myself. And that was when I really realized I had a serious interest in country music and the history of it. And in my own, I realized pretty quickly that I wanted to, admired songwriting, and I thought that would be, an interesting thing to pursue. I definitely had to teach myself. I wasn't, like you mentioned, my friend Mac McCon. He was writing songs, out of the gate, and had, came to Columbia with a bunch of records that he'd already played on and pressed himself, and was quite the indie musician. But it was also kind of a great do-it-yourself moment. Like there was this this feeling like, well, you don't have to be affiliated with a publisher or a label or you can just make up your own song and record it yourself and do something with it yourself. And so that was kind of a little ethos that was in the air at the time. And, I definitely thrived in that creative environment. And, I think I did take maybe modeled myself in a way after some of the other, there's so many people at Columbia and WKCR particularly who were interested in the history of jazz, and they were very seriously linking like history of jazz and the, records that were recorded with sort of an outer, what else is going on in the culture at the time. And so it's almost like an anthropological way of looking at, or a social studies kind of way of viewing the music and music culture as it comes out of the wider culture. So, I started thinking about country music that way and wanting to, connect it. I knew that from being up at Columbia, for instance, we would have these big jazz festivals on the radio. And so, and it would be like the, Louis Armstrong birthday broadcast for 4 days or something. Or we did a Bessie Smith one while I was there. And, Bessie Smith was from Tennessee and grew up in Chattanooga and had been part of this Southern music circuit before she made her way to New York. And, a lot of the other artists that I knew just from my growing up, my family were fans of Kitty Wells and some of the other, older female singers of country music. And it made me start to think like, well, wow, these people are all like, they're not from very far from one another. What's the connection between them and their music? Is there any, or is there pointedly not a connection? So that's kind of just an interest that I had, starting to try to link the country music to the other adjacent,
genres of music.
And to see how they might have all, not been that far away from each other. Categorically, we think of them as very separate, but is that because of our own, segregation of society?
Yeah, our own
in
musical
other ways.
segregation, right?
Right,
yeah,
right. So
and in a bigger sense in the society, right?
Right. So that's all stuff that was just, I still find myself, obviously, just in the last year, we've been asking those questions and talking about that a lot on my I have a streaming show now on, it's a streaming app, but, during starting, in the late spring with all of the social justice protests, I was like, wow, it really is kind of crazy. Like that there are only, only 2 or 3 successful country artists ever that have been Black. What's
that about?
Well, if you kind of, the answer is pretty obvious. Some people decided that it wasn't, they weren't interested in selling, music from Black artists to what they think of as a white audience. So it's, again, like just amazing to me. You can take a topic that is seemingly as, maybe not, is for recreation, country music, it's just something we do when we relax, whatever.
For fun, yeah.
But actually it connects very directly to these really burning questions that are happening right now in our society and why are things why things are the way they are. So anyway, that's, I'm not sure what your question was, but maybe just by having started pondering all this stuff up at Columbia, we've continued to think about it. And,
it set you on a path to continue thinking along those lines. It's fascinating to me. I'm intrigued by the idea that, your love of country music was cemented. Obviously the roots are there in Nashville, but your idea to sort of commit yourself further to country music and songwriting and all that happened in New York rather than, when you're at home. It's kind of, it's interesting, but maybe you need that perspective to come out of it and to kind of be like, okay, I always loved this stuff, but now maybe I want to do this as an artist, and.
Well, I think some of that also had to do with meeting, a lot of other music characters, from all the musicians that I've, been able to be acquainted with here, but also, writers like Nick Tosches and, who I got to meet when I was a DJ at KCR at Columbia, and his writing about country music and blues and, all the different strains of hillbilly music and sort of African-American rural music going into the blues, and how they were, he just wrote about it all as if it was like just threads from one tapestry.
Right.
And also not just with an American centric, but going back to looking at, how does this link to older literature and oral traditions versus recorded traditions and all of this stuff.
Right.
So, that was inspiring stuff that maybe in Nashville you would bump into people who had similar thoughts, but I think the commercialism of the Nashville being the business center for country music turns all,
right.
perspectives towards, well, what can we sell?
Towards the money game, right?
Or are you do you want to be an artist? Well, then how are we going to market you? Like that kind
Right.
of thinking that I never, my interest was really always in this more esoteric, like, what's this really about, and not so much in how to, how to market music or sell music. So in a way, that makes me a little bit of an odd duck from Nashville.
But it's in a good way, though. That's good. So I was curious. We're definitely going to dive further into the music, but since we're sort of at the college juncture here for you, I wanted to sort of ask this left field question. When you leave college, I was really curious to ask this. After college, you sort of take on a successful, ongoing parallel career, a gig in the world of finance. So as such, I was kind of wondering how you managed to sort of adeptly balance the two very different worlds, the business and the art thing, the left brain, right brain kind of thing. I was, usually, musicians are notoriously bad with money, So I was curious how you balanced those two things
I will
successfully
say
as you've done.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I had a sort of classic New York experience when I graduated from school. I had to, it was very clear from my family. They were like, we love it that you want to stay in New York, but you're going to have to pay for yourself to stay in New York. So I had to work, and I had a couple of jobs that I didn't think of as career jobs, that were just like, how do I get to pay my rent in New York so I can stay here and continue, being involved in these things that I'm interested in. And so, eventually I ended up, I probably had like a couple of temp jobs, accidentally in Wall Street firms. So it wasn't really like any kind of planned thing. Although I did notice when I was finally offered a role I worked with an equity research firm that did like, it was a little investment bank boutique that had a research division, and I had been temping in the research division, and they were always like, oh, we have a temp here who's from Columbia, and so I was like, yeah, well, I wasn't certainly doing anything that was high finance at all. It was more like filling out spreadsheets and clerical work. But they offered me a job, and I realized, because I'd sort of been keeping tabs on other full-time work that you could get, and it was slightly more money than if you got a similar job, an entry-level job in a publishing company or an advertising firm or whatever. And it was enough that I could pay my rent and also have a little extra to play with music stuff. And so, if I wanted to buy a new guitar, all right, I could cover it, or
right,
I had enough to, put away towards that. So I took that really just out of that, it just filled the need of needing to pay the rent. But what I found after I was there was that, we have these stereotypes of different businesses and what they're like. And, there were just a lot of very young, smart people who worked in the industry, and not all of them stayed, but, some would go on to have like high flying financial careers, and some it was just a stop on, towards going to grad school or whatever. But for me, it was just a consistent way to continue to make a living and be able to stay here. And then as I got involved in community radio and had the radio thrift shop, it funded all of those things, including my first few bands where, when I realized like, okay, if you want a drummer who can play country shuffle in New York City, you're going to have to hire one.
You have to pay for one. Yeah.
You have to pay.
Yeah.
It's not like in college where everybody just did it for the fun of it.
For the fun of it. Exactly.
So, that was my, sort of reasoning all along the way. Now, I did leave working for full-time for a finance company in the early 2000s when I was touring a lot and starting to get opportunities to travel. And then until after my daughter was born, she was probably 4 when I went back to work part-time. So I kind of, have dipped in and out of it as necessary, but
right.
I do think that for me, and this is just, other people wouldn't feel it this way about it, but there was a certain freedom in not having to, pay my mortgage or my rent out of earning music for,
Yes.
earning money that I'd earned from music, because it's only gotten in this 25 years since I got my first Wall Street job, it's only gotten that much harder to make money
For sure.
In the music business. So, and in fact, many musicians, when I got started, I knew so many people who played music, they had gigs every day, and there were venues and restaurants that had, musicians come and just play for their, the patrons in the restaurant or something. You could get those kind of gigs. Those are, now that every place has like Pandora piped in or whatever, you don't need live music as much as you
It's a shame.
to. So, for me, there was a freedom in not having to pay the bills that way that helped my creativity. For other people, the lack of time, the sacrificing the time that you give over to a full-time job would hurt what they were doing. And I understand that. And I've felt frustrated with that myself. But for me, that freedom to say, this isn't, I'm not writing this song because I'm trying to pay the rent, so.
Right. Yeah. There's something to be said for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you hear a lot of people say, oh, maybe you shouldn't have a plan B, I hear a lot of musicians say that, but, I did a similar thing to you, working in television for many years while I was working on music and making records. And it's just like, yeah, there's a certain, they don't talk about that there's a certain sense of security that that you do have with that kind of a day gig where you can, just be like, yeah, I can pay my bills and work on my music and not be worrying about starving. So it's interesting, but it's interesting that you balance that. Now, you had mentioned in the early 2000s, when you kind of left, when things were starting to happen for you, I wanted to talk about your debut record, Not the Tremblin' Kind. That was released in 2000 and made, quite a splash. It garnered a good deal of critical acclaim and sort of captured the attention of folks like Elvis Costello and legendary English DJ John Peel. Can you talk a little bit about those songs and how that record project came to be?
Sure. The Not the Tremblin' Kind record was songs that I'd written myself, and then songs that I had kind of collected while I was doing the radio thrift shop on WFMU in New Jersey. I would play local bands. I had a lot of local artists that I tried to support and do gig announcements for them and what have you, and play their recordings. And so I had a bunch of songs that I knew from my radio work that I had started performing in my own shows when I would play. And so when it came time to make a record, I had probably 4 or 5 years worth of songs that I'd learned that I hadn't written myself, but that sort of suited my personality and that I'd already been able to kind of work out in my local gigs. I probably played once a month, some Lakeside Lounge or Brownies or Mercury or whatever. And so, there were some really winning songs in that first group of songs that I recorded Amy Allison's brilliant "The Whiskey Makes You Sweeter."
Right, that's a great tune. I love
Beautiful
your version
song.
of it.
Yeah, when I first saw Amy, I was like, wow, this is Mose Allison's daughter, and here she is in like a thrift store dress with this. She had a band called the Maudlins, and they were just charmingly like kind of delicate in their playing, and she had the amazing song after amazing song, and "Whiskey Makes You Sweeter" was probably my favorite of the first batch of songs of hers that I was aware of. But also stuff like George Usher's song "Not the Trembling Kind," that song itself. It had just this great blend of, it almost sounded like 60s pop to me, but that could be sort of folk rock, like kind of twangy, but jangly, twangy.
Yeah, he's interesting. Like he's a label mate of mine. We were both on Parasol together.
Oh,
He's a great songwriter. Yeah, I love that tune.
Really great writer. And so I had co-opted those songs basically into my own live show. And then I had this handful of my own tunes like Queen of the Coast, that, was a song I wrote about Bonnie Owens. It really does kind of give maybe a sense of where I was at. Like, I'm sort of a history nerd for the women of country music, and but I'd seen in Bonnie this character that had this sort of pathos of having been, married to more famous artists and supported them and eclipsed by them in terms of fame and opportunities and what have you, and had taken care of their families and all of these things. And so I, I had loaded all that into the song Queen of the Coast. So, I knew that I felt confident about my few songs, but I didn't have 15 more of them of my own things written. So I had to draw on these other songs that I knew would sound great on an album. And fortunately, the group of songs itself, and I think the playing, which was all my local band, Jay Sherman Godfrey, John Graboff, Jeremy Chatsky, and Will Rigby from the DBs played
DBs,
drums.
sure.
That was kind of the core band. And I think we got really lucky that, we all were sort of into it and kind of captured the fairy dust of the moment of feeling like excited about those songs and about the potential for them. And I was very much, I did not know what I was doing. When I hear some of the songs and the way
Sounds
I
like you
sang
do.
them, well, it's funny because I feel like I listen to them and I go, oh my God, that vocal's so stiff.
I know.
I'm just
That's
sound
hard.
like.
It's hard to listen to yourself. You can't listen to your own records. It makes you like without. Isn't that terrible that you can't listen to your own stuff without thinking that?
It's pretty. You can be pretty embarrassed. But what's interesting, we had an opportunity to put them out on a little label in Scotland. And I did not know, that to me was absolutely, I had no idea whether that would be, would mean I'd get to travel over there and perform. I really didn't know. I just knew it would come out. And I was struggling a bit in the US and around New York. I was known as the DJ for the Radio Thrift Shop. So I was kind of like, I tell people I do I do my own music, and they would be like, it's kind of like a little dismissive, like, oh yeah, how cute, the DJ has her own record. So I had felt like I wasn't getting taken seriously. So I knew that if I put a record out, at least it would be out on a label, and it would be something that maybe would help me just get better gigs. Like I didn't know what it would amount to. What I hadn't counted on is that because the label, which was based in Glasgow, it was called Shoeshine Records. Spit and Polish was the Americana imprint of Shoeshine, and it was all run by Francis McDonald from the band Teenage Fan Club. And I didn't realize that they have art support grants for businesses like that. So Francis was getting some support to help market the records, and I had no idea of what the nationalized media would mean. So, I just thought, I never once occurred to me that John Peel would ever hear it or play it.
I was going to ask you about that next. Yeah, that's amazing. But go on.
Well, just that's it. Like I was, very pleasantly surprised that because they were working it to all the national media in the UK. And of course, it's a much smaller system than we have in the US. So there's not really anything analogous to, maybe it would be like getting it on local radio in a big city in the US. But there were these national programs with a really up and down the country reach, like the Bob Harris country program on Radio 2 and the John Peel program on Radio 1. And they both got behind it and played it. And in Peel's case, I think because he didn't know at first that I was a DJ, but I think because I had that DJ sensibility of like, I picked like my favorite songs from other records and I put them together in a set list that I knew that running order was solid. And he really responded to that. And it became like a record that he played a lot and talked about a lot. We were in his Festive 50. I think, I don't know where exactly we were in it, but a couple of songs were in the Festive 50. It was amazing. It was like, I went, I'm sitting behind my desk at Bank of America, and I've got a fax machine behind me, and the promoter in England is faxing me the radio reports, and they've got these quotes in them from John Peel about, so they did that as a little service so you could see if he said positive things. And I would just get these faxes and look at them and go, it's so bizarre. John Peel's making my record, and here I am sitting at a desk,
right, in New York at a bank.
Right. So, but what's also kind of, I love this part of the story, Peel he had not been to the U.S. in many years. And in 2000, he came back to the U.S. for the first time in like 30 years. And so he had, he was coming with some kind of BBC jaunt where they were taking it was like BBC, stars of the BBC were taking the Queen Elizabeth II. It was some
taking the boat
boondoggle thing. But he was in New York for a couple of days, and his producer got in touch with us and said, would you be willing to meet up with John Peel? And I just sat in my apartment in Brooklyn scratching my head like, surely John Peel has someone more famous that he wants to like hang out with in New York. But he really wasn't like that. He was thinking like, oh, there's this girl whose record I like, and we took him out for Indian food and drove him all around.
That's
we
awesome.
went to the Charlie Parker house, and
cool.
We drove him by CBGB so he could take a picture of CB. I mean, it was crazy, just a crazy fun connection that we got to make with him. And I was fortunate, he passed away in 2004. So, for 4 years we were good pals, and
that's great.
Visited often at Peel Acres, and that support that he gave my record, I still have people to this day, when we are able to play live shows, almost every single show, someone comes up and says, I first heard you on Peel.
That's amazing. That's crazy. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because you did like 5 Peel sessions, right? Is that what you did?
We did.
You did like 5, and that's like, just to do one is like such an honor, and it's it's just amazing. So I was going to ask you, like, what was that experience like doing a Peel session? Because so many famous people have done them and come through there, and it's just to be part of that is amazing. What was that like?
It was incredible. We did 2 from Maida Vale Studios in London, which is a big complex of BBC studios. I mean, it had a huge, amazing, like, room to record an orchestra, these, just incredible spaces. Pardon me.
It's New York City.
It's New York City. They're kind of loud out there tonight, Friday night. So we did a couple of sessions at Maida Vale, and then we got invited to do a session from John's house in East Anglia, which he called Peel Acres. And he'd gotten to the point where he could, BBC would let him do shows from home. I think he did 4 or 5 shows a week. So he did 2 or 3 of them from home. And so we were invited to his house and played there 3 times. So it was just really amazing. What was so incredible is that after the fact, after you play your session, especially when we were at Peel's house, he and his family had welcomed you there, and they would just have already, the bottles of wine were out, and he would be like and I relate to this. Like after you're done with the radio show, you have all this adrenaline, and so
Sure.
you want to hang out and visit. So we hung out with him for hours, and he told amazing stories about the Faces and Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney, and just all this, incredible stuff. So, that hospitality he showed us was really even more special than, having played us on the radio.
Yeah, there's something to be said for the hang afterwards, right? As we all know as musicians, that's like I think I like that more than the show, maybe.
That's right.
Yeah, it's crazy. But speaking of amazing experiences, I wanted to talk about another one, that you had, at least from my viewpoint. In 2008, you appeared as a guest on Elvis Costello's sort of short-lived but amazing music TV program called Spectacle. And you guys perform together. So I just have to stop right there and ask, what is it like to sing with Elvis Costello? Because it's got to be surreal.
It was surreal. And I have to say, I was very nervous because that program was such a huge operation to record a TV show entirely. I mean, they weren't broadcasting it live, but they were recording it in real time as if it were a live show.
It was at the Apollo, right?
It was at the Apollo,
Wow.
and it was
Not to add any extra pressure to anything.
Right, exactly. Right. And it was a James Taylor was the main musical guest, and so Elvis was singing. This was something he did. He would cover a song that his guests had a hit with or something. So he picked the James Taylor song "Bartender's Blues" and asked me to come sing the harmony on it. So it was
amazing,
very exciting, intimidating. I remember they were trying to get us to sing it on one mic, but there was absolutely no time to do a monitor check or anything.
Figure out the monitors.
I could not hear to save my life. So they did about 5 seconds of that, and they were like, "Yep, Laura's going to need her own mic." I was like, "Thank you so much."
And he's loud, right? Is he not a loud singer?
He's a very loud singer. In fact, that was something that was shocking to me because I've seen him perform a lot, and I know what he sounds like, but he's such a, there's a lot of sound coming out, and I was like,
right.
Whoa.
Hard to hear yourself for sure.
Very, very
with him
hard.
Standing next to you, yeah.
So it was a great opportunity and a great experience, and I'm still amazed that we got to do that.
It's crazy, and he's a fan too, because he loves your stuff, right?
He had been, we had opened a tour for him back in 2002 and stayed in touch with him. And he and Diana Krall have twins that are just about 2 months or 3 months younger than my daughter Bella. So, we'd had little kids at the same time, and I'd sent them books. We just had tried to stay in touch and be, kind of. I've been a fan of his since I was basically in high school. So, it's a big, huge honor, and I'm still amazed.
Yeah, crazy. He's a legend, and just to have that experience is awesome. I wanted to talk about one of your other heroes. I believe it's one of your heroes. In 2011, you released your fourth long player, Kitty Wells Dresses, and it's a record you made in honor of pioneering female country singer Kitty Wells. Now, for those who might not be familiar, would you mind talking a little bit about Kitty, what her music means to you, and why you sort of decided to take on that project? I know, again, another hero of yours, I think, right?
Absolutely. Kitty Wells is the first female artist in country music to get to make her own album, to have, whatever they call it, a million-selling record, chart-topping record that was, broke some sales records because it was an answer song called "It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels." It was an answer song to a tune called "The Wild Side of Life" that had been a hit by a guy named Hank Thompson.
Really? Wow, I didn't know that. I knew the song, but I didn't know that was an answer song. Oh wow,
it's
cool.
An answer song. It's got the same melody as that tune, and the answer song though was far and beyond more huge hit because I think it did tap into some kind of zeitgeist in of the moment where women were, kind of starting to become more independent and say, hey, you can't blame women for all the ills of society.
Right.
And certainly not every broken marriage is some woman's fault.
Right.
So it was a kind of a pushback moment. And Kitty Wells herself, she was a very soft-spoken, and I would almost call her like demure. She, to me, she reminded me of like women in my family, my dad's family, very Southern in that sort of stoic way where you don't talk about a lot of things. So to have her in song be so forthright in saying, in sort of just portraying a woman's point of view in song and doing it pretty forcefully was very powerful. And she had a singing style that is to people's ears now, it's very old fashioned, but it also reminds me of kind of this Southern character where it's not overly embellished or, it's not a demonstrative style where you do a lot of acrobatic things with the vocal. Instead, there's a lot of tight, it's almost like the emotions kind of straining to break through the sound of her voice. And so there's this kind of, she has a very, very hard vibrato in her voice that is kind of brings that to mind for me. So I always thought she was fascinating. She was a very demure lady, very much a traditional, she was marketed as the perfect housewife who also happens to make records and be the queen of country music.
Music, right.
She had, Kitty Wells' recipe book, and there would be these, in media of the day, there would be Kitty Wells at home, and it would be her like in an apron behind the vacuum cleaner, like cleaning the house before going to the gig. And it was just, obviously a lot of that was just how they were trying to sell her. But to me, I thought like, wow, the reality was much more that, she and her husband were both artists. He had his band, the Tennessee Mountain Boys, had been very successful, but they had worked hard towards having successful records. It was almost kind of an afterthought that she recorded the song that became this huge hit. But once she had that hit, her husband planned along with her to buck some conventional wisdom that female artists were not major artists. They just didn't, for whatever reason, that was the conventional wisdom, that they couldn't sell tickets. They couldn't have their own albums. They were just occasionally featured, not the main attraction. And he, maybe not trying to be a feminist supporter, but more so looking at the records they were selling, he decided, hey, Kitty's selling way more records than we are. We're going to put her name on the top of the bill. And I'm going to now take my career and put it in the secondary spot and to help her develop her career. It was a really radical thing that they did in the 50s. Sure, they actually went against all the conventional wisdom of the time. And to chase that lifestyle was not glamorous or easy or, so to me, she's kind of this pioneer who, because of maybe the style of her music now sounds kind of antiquated. People pay lip service to what she did, but they don't always hear in her music how radical she was. And that's why I wanted to make a record. I chose some songs that, she would do a song that she and her husband wrote together. It's called I Don't Claim to Be an Angel. And it's all about having had premarital sex, and this is like 1953 and you can't say that, so
it's pretty crazy for the time, for sure.
Right. It's very much, my life is full of sin, the song says. So it's code. And it's code that they got away with it, and it's so it's fascinating to me, and I just always give Kitty a lot of props. I was able to meet her when I was making. I'd really? Met her actually because when I was a little kid, we lived down the street from her, but because she and her husband never they lived always in this modest ranch house in East Nashville, but you knew you were in the neighborhood because you could see there's a bus parked outside of the house. It says Kitty Wells on the side. But so I got to meet her and her husband. He was, probably maybe a year before he died and a couple years before she passed away, and just present them with this project. And
that's fantastic.
And it was really one of the most sweet kind of moments of my career making music because I really had, I'd written a song about her and then I'd paid this tribute to her, and they were so sweet and gracious and just really grateful, that somebody had kind of gotten their story. It was really sweet. So
yeah, it's nice to know that, when somebody gets it and, gets your life's work and puts it back to you and in front of you, like, hey, you've really inspired me. And, it's great when that happens. And, it sounds like they appreciated your acknowledging it. Now, I wanted to also touch on one last thing, which we haven't, you've touched on it a little bit, but the sort of your other parallel career, which is radio. In addition to your travels as a singer-songwriter, you've spent an extensive amount of time on the airwaves as a DJ, / presenter from your college radio days, like you said, on through the show you created, the radio Thrift Shop, which you mentioned, up to your work today with the programs Dark Horse Radio and States of Country. I was curious, like, what is it about your love of this medium? What is it about this medium that you love so much, and why, along with singing and playing, it seems like it's sort of remained a constant in your life? So I was curious to, hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it is interesting. I hadn't paid attention to, I guess I'd always been a radio listener. I did listen to, had a little radio in my room when I was a kid, and I would listen to it while I did my homework sometimes. And I knew, I'd heard the Grand Ole Opry. We had some early morning radio in Nashville that was very particular to Nashville. It was called the Waking Crew. And it was all studio musicians who would, play on records. But they had kind of like a pop band where they would do like back rack tunes, and they'd have, a singer in who maybe was just getting started on a label, and it was very loose. And so I had like experiences, appreciating radio like that. But I hadn't thought about doing it myself until, of course, at Columbia, when the opportunity came to hang out at WKCR. And then, I really appreciated what they did was such a high quality, deep dives into music careers and catalog. And it was such a great place to learn and to sort of study how other people were doing that. And then I realized pretty quickly, a lot of that also, I will just give a big shout out to my friend Phil Schapp, who's still on the air at KCR, and has been, he's the longtime jazz DJ there, who's taught a lot of students over the years about, just even through his own enthusiasm, like what's kind of important in the music and what's, how do you tell the story of it to a generation that hasn't heard it yet? Those kind of things were really exciting to watch him do back in the 80s when I was a student. So I hadn't thought about making radio myself until coming and seeing that at KCR, but I realized there was nobody doing that same type of serious sort of exploration of the music for country music there. So I just kind of modeled myself on what Phil and the other people in the jazz department were doing, but just did it with country records instead.
Interesting. Wow.
But it was a great way to, kind of just get started. It was a great model to have. And then what I realized pretty quickly was that it wasn't scary. There was something, it's still to me slightly scary to get up and sing in front of people, but somehow sitting down and talking about records that I like or trying to explain to people the change or the evolution of a style of country music or what's important about this particular artist, why you played these records, that to me it came very naturally. And so I've just continued to do it all these years. I've struggled sometimes, would have probably stayed on FMU if I hadn't had a kid and and all of a sudden,
life intrudes. Yeah.
Right. All the real life things that you take up your time. But in the last few years, being able to do, the Gimme Country Show, which is a streaming app. And so you can, just download it on your phone and listen. But I mostly do that from home, but it's still like the joyfulness of being able to like pick some records you're excited about, new artists, it helps me sort of stay contemporary with what's going on in the Americana world, and it's fun to do it. So and it creates a community, or it allows me to connect with a community where people who appreciate it. Now that we were starting to do this back at FMU, where you'd have like the playlist going and people commenting while the show was going on. You're starting to interact with the community instead of it being this one-way thing. But I do appreciate that as well, and it often gives me ideas of stuff I hadn't thought of. And so, it's funny, in my house, my daughter, she's 14 now, but when she was about 10, she was an absolute crazy nut for the Beatles. And her favorite Beatle was George
Harrison.
Harrison.
Her right.
Yeah, I have to say I had nothing to do with it. I wish I could claim it, but her music teacher in elementary school would use is it Yellow Submarine, the cartoon. They would, if they had like 10 minutes left of class and she didn't have something prepared, she'd put on Yellow Submarine.
That's cool.
So all the kids knew that film, and it just got Bella obsessed. So, but her favorite Beatle was George Harrison. So when I got the opportunity to be the host of the George Harrison show for the Beatles channel at SiriusXM, that was also another big, kind of sweet for me. My daughter still to this day thinks I'm not qualified because I don't have all the George knowledge that she does.
Oh, I see.
Fortunately, the show itself is the content's really run by the Harrison Archive. So it's really, I've learned a lot doing that program also. So, if that's, as long as it all fits, we can juggle it all. Like I'm really quite happy to have that as another way to express, my interest and love for music.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like you're a fan. That's the one thing I find with some musicians, they lose the ability to be a fan and a listener. Like I listen to so much music, just whatever I'm doing around the house. I felt like I've never lost that, ability to be a fan. Whereas some musician friends of mine, if they're working on their own music, they have, really no interest in listening as, so I think it's a testament to your love of not only the radio, but music in general, that you keep that going.
Yeah, I think that it can be nourishing, when we don't have time. I mean, and obviously I've chosen a structure for my life where, I don't spend 100% of my time on music, but in those down periods when I'm not, working on writing or outperforming or what have you, that flowing in of music helps me to kind of stay. It kind of keeps sort of a something running in background. I hate using computer metaphors for thinking and creativity, but there is something to be said for like, a kind of letting time pass, and you're observing things over time and letting them steep a little while before you're making your next expression with them. So that's been my mode.
Inspiration, you've got to have some of that coming in to create some of your own stuff for sure. Well, hey Laura, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it's been, really fun listening to your thoughts on things throughout, your career and allowing us to sort of follow along with your creative journey. Thank you again, and much continued success. But before we let you go, you're going to do a song for us, right? I was curious what the name of the tune was, and maybe you could, tell us a little something about the tune.
I'd be happy to. So yes, I wanted to do a song that I wrote with one of my neighbors here in Jackson Heights. And actually, one of the things, I'll just backtrack to say, my husband and I, when we moved to Jackson Heights from Williamsburg, we were a little bit trepidatious about leaving Brooklyn. We had so many associations with like places we played in Brooklyn, and all of our music friends were there. And we were, somewhat, kind of comforted by the fact that so many musicians have lived in these neighborhoods in Queens along the 7 train over many years, people who played, in show music and Broadway and jazz musicians. And we live pretty close to the Louis Armstrong House, and the Queens Jazz Trail out here. It's really something to be proud of. But there also are so many great local musicians in Queens these days. So my friend Franklin Bruno, who's a writer and a singer-songwriter and an artist himself, lives a couple blocks over, and he's somebody who primarily composes on keyboards. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, I never felt comfortable enough to write on the piano because I stopped my music education too quickly on the keyboards. So we collaborated on this song that I'd like to play for you guys called Someday Sparrow. And unfortunately, you're just going to hear me playing guitar, but for those of you who maybe know chord progressions, you might recognize a few moves here that aren't normal progressions that you would play on a guitar neck. So cool. Anyway, for me and Franklin Bruno from Jackson Heights, Someday Sparrow.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and let's get right to it. So here's Laura Cantrell on Queen's Creative.
Someday, sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Someday, sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Little sparrow is gonna fly away. Mighty sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Paid a visit by the mystery. My door was darkened with misery. Long to see with your heart set free. Someday, sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Someday, sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Little sparrow is gonna fly away. Mighty sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Met an old friend on the road, and I asked to share his load. Said it wasn't mine to bear, but he knew a song that we could share. Someday, sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Someday, sparrow, you're gonna fly away. Little sparrow is gonna fly away. Mighty sparrow, you're gonna fly away.
Big thanks to Laura Cantrell for visiting Queen's Creative and taking the time out to talk with us. To learn more about Laura and her work, visit lauracantrell.com. That's LauraCantrell.com. Well, there you have it, folks. That's it for this episode of QC. I don't know about you kids, but I had a lot of fun today. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your pods, and please visit Queens Public Television on the web at qptv.org. QPTV can also be found on Facebook at facebook.com/Queens Public Television, and on Twitter and Instagram, we're at QPTV. Queens Creative was produced, written, recorded, and mixed by yours truly. Thanks for listening. I'm Mark Bacino. Till next time, take care, people.